Welcome to the final part of the Zenith Perfect walkthrough. We arrived at the Horizon Energy Station Mission 10.1, which is basically the second final campaign map in the series. Now there are a few things to say about this map, and in some ironic way it made the same mistakes as the endings of the original Unreal, that is the Extreme series wherein you're entering the Scar mothership. So basically the whole set of maps that indulges in the Scar texture package, basically you're inside the mothership, and so it has that whole setting of the Scar alien base. Those maps essentially forgot about what their purpose was as ending maps, and sort of just guided the player through hallways and hallways, which were very intricate but really didn't play any substantive purpose in the gameplay, and didn't really do much for the final half of the game as a whole. So essentially, they didn't really take advantage of conceptual grandness in any substantive way, and a lot of the maps that ended up basically being on the other end of the game were present more so as annoyances that did have some interesting and challenging gameplay, but were never really memorable in the first place. So this map is in some regards similar, except it's unusually simplistic, but it sort of goes off the same sort of pattern of hallways and hallways, and it tends to be in some cases not necessarily intricate, but cramped in and sort of following the pipeline style of mapping that usually Zenith tries to avoid. The interior designs are very simplistic, except for a few cases, like the unique hallway that crosses through the dam. There are also some unique areas of scenery here and there, and a few unique gameplay events that contribute to the atmosphere, but it all sort of comes off as scrambled eggs. It doesn't really play together, and you can notice that a lot of the components of this map don't really fit well together in the first place. So although the map is very cleanly made, there is a clear amount of evidence that it was rushed, and the amount of content throughout the map is pretty sparse in comparison to its size, as compared to all other Zenith maps. Most of the map has little brush detail, and in some cases the areas presented are merely there to make up a less linear form of the pipelined A to B to C kind of run through that is typically unorthodox in Zenith, and suddenly is pretty much the greater portion of the final or second to final campaign map. And a lot of this might have been the effect of rushing the map, but to plainly put it, the atmosphere and the whole world of the map is uninspired. The music is completely out of tune with the atmosphere of the map, and there are more hallways than anything else, for the first half at least, so the visuals are decent enough to get by, but nowhere near the standard they should have been held to. So you would surmise that the conceptual grandness in conjunction with the atmosphere is undeveloped or underdeveloped. And you can even tell in reviewing the areas of the map that are most profound with regards to this characteristic, that since the most visually impressive region is just a hallway, that hallway where there's a lot of lighting detail where you cross the dam, there were a lot of things that fell short, and by extension the visual impact is also disappointing. So throughout most of the map the player is more concerned about passing through hallways to get to the next button rather than stopping to appreciate the view, particularly because the view doesn't exist. The only aspect of the level which compensates somewhat for these disappointments is the gameplay. And in some regards, the gameplay is sort of on the better, more appreciable side. The gameplay is very challenging in this map, and particularly those unique events, once you get to the end half, make up for a lot of what is essentially typical orthodox boring gameplay that is in the beginning. Even if it is challenging, it's sort of something that we've seen tons of times before, so it doesn't come off as original as it did the past 3 or 4 times it was presented. So the defense gameplay was basically unheard of in Unreal gameplay, just in general single-player campaigns, and although it was sort of a primitive form of something that could have been very extensive, the fact that it went so far already with controllable, configurable turrets and placeable turrets and mines and all of this, that was sort of an unexpected arrival to the player, which at least spiced up the map to some degree. And the same was the case for the mini-boss right after the defense setup, or any of the confrontations seen throughout the map that presented formidable enemies to the player in a unique case wherein the environment played some role. But the map is breezed through, basically, and its importance is pretty questionable. I mean, there's little storyline to take into consideration, and there's really no detail to what little translator messages there are. The whole purpose of the map was clearly just to push the player through the escape of Vector's base, but instead of going out with a bang, it goes out with a whimper. I mean, there's a lot that could have been done in this map that was not done, and in some respects, were it not for the unique gameplay events at the end of the map, this would have been probably the least convincing and lowest ranked map in the entire campaign in terms of an overall rating were it to be given one. Even considering that perhaps to some degree the annoyances of the old style of design in Mission 3 and 4, or Mission 5 particularly, there would still be some inclination to favor them in terms of a ranking, because at least they do have new content that is thorough, and there's something behind there that is actually substantive. Although in the case of Mission 5, there were some cases wherein perhaps the gameplay here still sort of defeated it in terms of creativity, and I guess to some degree that's true anyway. The defense gameplay here particularly sort of wiped a lot of other things off the map, but excluding this one part, which sort of is the highlight of the level anyway, there isn't really anything else that can rank up to other cases within other maps wherein a lot more content in terms of gameplay and storyline was present. One thing to take notice in general is the degree to which certain maps are awe-inspiring in some respects with regards to the presentation or some scenery, and where others have no substantive memorability to them. And I think that was pretty much due to the fact that many of them were rushed. But the ones wherein time was taken to scrap the bad ideas or the poor designs in favor of new ones had the upper hand, and the places in which less concepts were balled up and thrown into the trash ended up being less inspiring because the best ideas were never realized. So you can imagine that if there was no demand for a due date, or time wasn't of the essence, if you will, that there would have been plenty of time to cultivate the best visual concepts and draw them out in 3 dimensions. But that's sort of the result of due dates in the working world, unfortunately. One thing I'd like to comment on about the defense setup, basically the best way to quickly and efficiently defend against the invading Marines is to set the placeable turrets right in front of the mounted tower turrets, because that way they're close enough to the Marines that they can take them down easily, and their view is not obfuscated, but far enough away that they are not caught in the cannon fodder, if you will, of the mounted turrets, and at the same time they have enough distance that their detectors properly take aim at targets that are going to get closer to them in the first place instead of getting further away. So basically, if you can see the video, it's fairly close to the tower mounted turrets where you should be placing those placeable turrets, because it's actually kind of challenging to defend against the invading Marines. It might look easy in this case, I don't really think it does, but to some degree it is sort of set up, and then the Marines get wiped out pretty easily. They do a lot of damage, and there are a ton of them, so they're going to go through and do pretty heavy damage to the nodes in the first place. So it's probably advisable to tactically place your placeable turrets in some manner that is most effective, like I just showed right there. And also that's the same thing for the upcoming mini-boss fight. Basically, if you don't hit the hover jet with those two Redeemer missiles, you're going to have a pretty difficult time taking it down, and the best next step is just to use the rocket launcher, or maybe the shock rifle with combos if you have that, although that's going to be kind of difficult too, because I think it has around 1200 or 1000 damage, so you're going to have to hit it twice anyway with something that has pretty heavy damage. So you have to take your time and use the alternate fire to control the Redeemer missiles. Don't try to just do a one-shot kill, because it's not going to work. Now we come upon the final campaign level in Zenith, the Sunken Citadel. And in this case, the atmosphere does compensate well enough to patch up the worries of the player given off by the previous map in terms of how well designed or how presentable the next few maps are going to be. In this case, the presentation is aesthetic and revamps the conceptual grandness that had been lost in Mission 10.1. And now, by the way, the best way to defeat the Queen mini-boss is pretty much by waiting at a certain point where she's going to teleport every so often, which you can figure out just by seeing her teleport a few times across the level. So if you hover there in a small locale, you can pretty much easily drop the bombs without having to jump from point to point, and it's sort of difficult to get the hover jet moving in the first place, so perhaps you might want to just stay in a locale instead, as I said, and drop bombs in a smaller region. So anyway, this map, even as the player enters the interior, does have a personality, which the previous map didn't really. And while it is somewhat atmospheric, there is very little detail, and in fact this is the least detailed map overall in the entire campaign. There's very little content in it, and the whole point is pretty much to kill your way through to the target. The exterior does well to present a conceptually grand location, and the interior is not so sparse and simplistic that the player has nothing to visually enjoy. At the same time, however, it is noticeable that the map was rushed, or at least it's rather simplistic compared to most Zenith maps, and the player at this point surely has gotten used to tons and tons of detail, not only in terms of visual detail, but also in terms of gameplay and content, everywhere from battles to events to storyline. And when you go through this map, it's clearly lacking, particularly when you get to the lower levels and you realize that most of the rooms are pretty empty. So the map is sort of an ending point in the campaign where the player can go out with a louder bang than in the previous map, and it certainly achieves that. But the map as a whole is so short, and there isn't really enough substantive gameplay that the player feels like they've actually achieved something tangibly significant after they've gone through the map. And again, it was clearly rushed, not to the point that it felt rushed or that it needed more detail within its present existence space for the most part. It needed to have more content in the first place. It needed more space and more detail as a whole, not just adding more detail to the rooms that were already in existence, but extending the base, making the base larger, and perhaps it could have had something like Vector's subaquatic or Vector Aquatic complex, where there's tons of content and it was enjoyable. Think of all the creative possibilities for gameplay that this map could have yielded if it were long like the standard Zenith maps, perhaps something like Mission 2.2. But the good news is that the gameplay that is already there does well to present a challenge to the player, and the mini-boss was a fun addition to what would otherwise have been a fairly typical battle within Zenith. And the usage of vehicles was also a unique touch, and so all of this did provide enough entertainment for the map to pass by as entertaining and acceptable, but again, it passes by very quickly, and there isn't much to explore throughout the rest of the map, which ends up being very plain. The same goes for storyline, which there isn't much of, just a few translator events explaining what's going on in that particular region. The one thing that is memorable is the presentation of the exterior, particularly in the beginning, which becomes a nostalgic scene in and of itself. So that was Zenith. And I'm pretty much putting my conclusion here because I have a lot of commentary on how the final boss fight works. Zenith was the result of an immense amount of work and a sort of accidental happening. Yes, a lot of work went into it, and the campaign was very elaborate and unique in all kinds of ways and very unorthodox, and a bit of a maverick among Unreal campaigns in terms of its method of approach to entertainment. But the whole point was really just the passion of creating worlds and places, taking scenes of fantasy and science fiction from the imagination and attempting to design them in a 3D canvas. It was toying with visual artwork and scenery and indulging in the observations of architecture of all kinds. Most of Zenith, I think, was not really intended to be played as a video game. Most of the maps were made for the fun of designing environments out of the imagination, pressing the engine to the limit and seeing how far one could go with some visual techniques. To the player, a lot of the scenery is well appreciated, but passed by in a breeze as they tread from battle to battle. But remember, for every impacting, eye-catching, maybe even awing, inspiring, or just interesting scene that you pass by, there was a mapper that spent hours and hours thinking about that scene, analyzing the look and feel of it, and building it up with all other scenes in order for the player to pass through a construction of all those subconstructs. And that was Zenith in a nutshell. Now we come to the final boss fight in Zenith, which I still argue is the most difficult in the entire campaign. You start off combating a boring version of Kenos, after which 3 monsters spawn: the Scar, the Nally, and the Slith. So on normal mode, damage is reduced and the Scar and Nally do not have their intermediate phases where they do their special attacks. And I believe this Slith also doesn't even have a fire mode and the damage is reduced. But we'll assume that you are fighting them on heroic mode, which is a lot more challenging. The first one you will fight is the Scar, and what I recommend you do is use heavy projectiles like the flak shells and shock combos to damage him down, because every time you hit him, his speed and damage doubles. And if you use bullets or light projectiles, he's going to get a maximum, where he'll easily throw you off the platform, and he's incredibly fast at that point. Oh, and by the way, this is also probably the coolest boss arena in the game. Maybe an exception would be the boss in the hydro power plant after the Vector Rocket Lab, because it was a very elaborate design, but in terms of location, this definitely tops it. So anyway, what you're going to have to do after he gets down to 75% health or so is jump on one of the side platforms, because he's going to clone himself and become invincible. And at that point, you just have to damage him down and avoid damage, because you'll definitely need it later. That is, you'll need a lot more health for this next one, because after about half a minute he's going to return to his normal state, and after getting him down to low health, he freezes. That's when the Nally unfreezes, and this is probably the hardest of the three actually, because he has insane damage. You can pretty much not get hit by any one of his shots. You might be able to scratch one off, but after two you're screwed. So the best thing you can do is save a few flak shells for this boss and get as far away from him as possible. And you just have to spam flak shells. After that, around 50% health, he's going to turn invisible and red plasma balls are going to stream towards you from all four corners. So you're basically going to have to use a streaming fire. That's the best way, like the outfire of the pulse gun or the minigun, and shoot around the center platform to find him. And he's not totally invisible. You might be able to see him. He has sort of like a cloak of white fire that's slightly invisible. And after you attack him, he's going to go back to his original state, so you can get ready to dodge right after you damage him, because he's going to escape that state. And get as far away from him as possible, then damage him down to low health. After this, the Scar and Nally are going to alternate freezing and unfreezing for about 6 or 7 times before they're both going to disappear. Then the Slith unfreezes. Now, he's not necessarily as hard as the Nally, but if you are not careful, you will die very easily. First, he spits fire blobs that stick to you and damage you down for about 25% of your health if you have armor, and then 50% if you do not. And also, every so often he's going to turn into flames, and if you get close to him at that point, you'll get burned for a lot of damage. Then finally he summons flames all over the center platform, which, if you are in the center platform at that time, you basically have about 1 second to run for the side platforms. And when you are on the side platforms and he is not in flame mode, he can spawn explosions all over the side platforms, so as soon as he exits the fire mode, you have to get as close to him as possible again, while maintaining some distance in case it goes into flames again. So pretty much the trick is to get close to him enough that you don't get harmed by the side explosions, but far enough away that you don't get burned by his AoE damage. Follow that rule over and over while you do damage him a ton, and eventually you'll take him down. Now, if you have defeated all of the bosses on heroic mode without cheating, and you go to the main start menu after finishing the campaign, you'll notice that a congratulatory message pops up and a button appears. And this is basically a little bonus scene that the heroic players can access that was supposed to be part of the opening sequel to the last few maps of Zenith, which were obviously never created. So it's ended up being just a bonus scene for those players that did finish all the bosses on heroic mode.
Sir, it was authorized by the commander. There was nothing we...
Your forage.
Research Incorporated has been fuming about the incident, Griffin. You wanted compensation for damages. I told them they should have hired a better commander. But the infiltrators took something and they're not too happy about that either.
Alright. What did they take, exactly?
Just this, but they're missing a piece of it.
Let's just give them what they want then.